Zachary Taylor was a man of paradoxes who rose from a Virginia plantation to the U.S. presidency, only to have his term cut short by a mysterious illness that sparked over a century of assassination rumors. Born in 1784 and raised on the Kentucky frontier, he was a product of the planter aristocracy and a lifelong slave owner. Yet as president, he resisted the spread of slavery into new territories, fearing it would tear the Union apart. His 40-year military career earned him the nickname Old Rough and Ready and cemented his status as a national hero, particularly after his stunning victories in the Mexican-American War. Despite having no political experience and never having voted, the Whig Party nominated him for president in 1848, hoping his fame would unite a nation fractured by sectional tensions. He reportedly warned Southern leaders that if they seceded, he would personally lead the army to preserve the Union. His sudden death in July 1850 came at a critical moment, paving the way for the Compromise of 1850 and fueling suspicions of foul play. In 1991, his body was exhumed to test for arsenic poisoning, a scientific investigation that aimed to solve one of America's most enduring historical mysteries. His father, a distinguished officer in the Revolutionary War, instilled in him a powerful sense of military duty. But Taylor was not a product of the old Virginia gentry. He was forged on the Kentucky frontier. When he was just an infant, his family made the arduous trek west, trading the settled world of tidewater plantations for the raw, dangerous promise of untamed land. His education wasn't found in formal academies, but in the practical, harsh lessons of frontier life, managing a farm, navigating the wilderness, and learning the brutal economics of a society built on enslaved labor. This upbringing created a man of action, not of letters, pragmatic, self-reliant, and indifferent to hardship. It also placed at his core the central paradox of his life. He was a devoted Unionist and a lifelong slave owner, a contradiction that would later define his presidency. As he entered early manhood, the path before him was uncertain. He was the third of 9 children, a younger son in a world where the eldest typically inherited the bulk of the family estate. While a life as a planter was a possibility, another calling beckoned, one that resonated with the stories of his father's past and the martial spirit of the frontier. In 1803, the United States had purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the country overnight. This vast new expanse needed to be explored, secured, and defended. The U.S. Army, though small, was the instrument of this national project, a force tasked with manning a string of remote outposts, protecting settlers, and asserting American sovereignty on a continent still contested by European powers and Native American nations. For a young man like Zachary Taylor, who possessed physical courage and a practical mind but lacked a taste for politics or the law, the Army offered a path to honor, advancement, and adventure. In 1808, with the help of his family's political connections, the 23-year-old Taylor secured a commission as a first lieutenant in the 7th U.S. Infantry Regiment. The army he joined was a far cry from the mighty military machine of today. It was a tiny professional force of just a few thousand men, scattered in small garrisons across the immense frontier. It was a life of slow promotions, modest pay, and often mind-numbing boredom, punctuated by moments of intense danger. But for Taylor, it was a perfect fit. He took to the discipline and structure of military life with a natural aptitude. His plain-spoken, no-nonsense style and his willingness to share the hardships of his men quickly earned him their respect. 2 years after joining the Army in June of 1810, he made a decision that would provide the emotional anchor for the rest of his peripatetic life. He married Margaret Peggy McCall Smith, the daughter of a prominent Maryland planter. Peggy was a woman of quiet strength and immense resilience, qualities she would need in abundance as the wife of a career Army officer. She would spend the next 4 decades following her husband from one remote, often primitive frontier post to another, raising their children in the challenging and often lonely world of the garrison. Theirs was a deep and enduring partnership, a private sanctuary of stability in a life defined by constant movement and uncertainty. Taylor's early years in the Army were spent in the mundane but necessary duties of a junior officer. He commanded troops in Indiana and Louisiana, learning the practical arts of supply, discipline, and leadership in the quiet backwaters of the nation. But the peace of the early 19th century was fragile. Tensions were rising with Great Britain over issues of maritime rights and with Native American tribes in the Northwest Territory over the relentless pressure of white settlement. A storm was gathering, and Zachary Taylor was about to be thrust directly into its path. The crucible that would first test his mettle and forge his reputation was a small, isolated stockade on the banks of the Wabash River in the Indiana Territory, Fort Harrison. The year was 1812. The United States had declared war on Great Britain, and the American frontier erupted in a new wave of violence. For years, the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, had been working to build a pan-tribal confederacy to resist American expansion. In November of 1811, while Tecumseh was away, the territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, had led an army to the Confederacy's capital at Prophetstown, defeating the native forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The battle was a major setback for Tecumseh's movement, but it did not extinguish the flames of resistance. Instead, it fanned them into a full-blown frontier war, with many tribes now allied with the British. In this atmosphere of fear and escalating conflict, Captain Zachary Taylor was given command of Fort Harrison, a crucial but vulnerable outpost near the modern-day city of Terre Haute, Indiana. The fort itself was a primitive affair, a simple rectangular stockade built of freshly cut timber with a blockhouse at each corner. It was an island of American authority in a vast and hostile wilderness. By late summer, Taylor's command was in a perilous state. A malarial fever had swept through the garrison, leaving many of his men desperately ill. Of his small force of about 50 soldiers, only a handful were fit for duty. Taylor himself was just recovering from the fever, still weak but resolute. On the evening of September 4th, 1812, a force of some 600 warriors, a combined group of Potawatomi, Wee, Shawnee, and Kickapoo, crept through the dense forest surrounding the fort. They had come to wipe it off the face of the earth. The attack began under the cover of darkness, a terrifying eruption of musket fire and war cries. The small, sickly garrison was jolted from their beds, scrambling to their posts in the moonless night. But the main assault was not one of bullets, it was one of fire. The attackers set fire to one of the fort's blockhouses, which also contained the contractor's supply of whiskey. The flames, fed by the alcohol, exploded into a raging inferno, quickly consuming the structure and opening a terrifying 20-foot gap in the fort's defensive wall. Panic gripped the defenders. The scene was one of hellish chaos. The roar of the fire, the crackle of burning timbers, the incessant musket fire from the darkness, and the horrifying screams of 2 soldiers trapped and burned alive in the collapsing blockhouse. Above it all were the triumphant cries of the attacking warriors, who now poured a relentless fire into the breach, believing the fort was theirs. In this desperate moment, with his command on the verge of collapse, Captain Zachary Taylor's character was revealed. While others panicked, he remained preternaturally calm, his voice steady and commanding, cut through the din of battle. He immediately organized the small number of able-bodied men, directing them to form a bucket brigade to fight the flames. It was a hopeless task. Realizing the blockhouse was lost, he made a split-second decision. He ordered his men to tear down the roof of an adjacent barracks building, creating a fire break to prevent the blaze from spreading to the rest of the fort. As this was happening, he directed a handful of his best marksmen to lay down a continuous fire from the remaining blockhouses, keeping the enemy from storming through the gap. The most critical task, however, was to plug the breach in the wall. It was a suicide mission. Under a constant hail of enemy fire, Taylor himself led his men, weakened by fever, in constructing a temporary breastwork, a 5-foot-high barricade of logs and earth across the gap. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy, a handful of men fighting fire, musket balls, and their own physical exhaustion, driven by the sheer force of their commander's will. For 8 long, terrifying hours, until the sun rose on a scene of devastation, the small garrison held on. When dawn finally broke, the attackers, astonished that the fort had not fallen and unwilling to risk a daylight assault against a now repaired defense, melted back into the forest. Fort Harrison had been saved. It was an almost miraculous victory, a testament to the incredible courage of a handful of sick soldiers and the unshakable leadership of their 27-year-old captain. Taylor's official report of the battle, written in his clear, unadorned prose, was published in newspapers across the country. In a war marked by a series of embarrassing American defeats and surrenders, the heroic defense of Fort Harrison was a desperately needed piece of good news. Overnight, Zachary Taylor became a national hero. The War Department rewarded his bravery with a brevet promotion to the rank of major. It was the first, but by no means the last, time that his coolness under fire would capture the imagination of the American people. The quiet, practical man from the Kentucky frontier had proven himself a commander of extraordinary ability. The foundations of the legend of Old Rough and Ready had been laid. The end of the War of 1815 brought a deceptive quiet to the American frontier. The great pan-tribal confederacy of Tecumseh had been shattered, and the British threat in the Northwest had been extinguished. For the United States, it was a moment of burgeoning national confidence, an era of good feelings. But for the professional soldiers of the U.S. Army, it was the beginning of a long and frustrating peace. The nation, ever suspicious of a large standing army, quickly downsized its military. Regiments were consolidated, officers were discharged, and promotions, which had come swiftly in wartime, slowed to a glacial pace. For a man like Zachary Taylor, whose identity had been forged in the heat of battle, this new era of garrison duty presented a different, more insidious kind of challenge. The slow, grinding war against boredom and obscurity. Following his celebrated defense of Fort Harrison, Taylor continued to serve with distinction for the remainder of the war. But in May of 1815, the peacetime reductions hit home. In a reorganization of the Army, he was demoted from the rank of major back down to captain. For Taylor, a man of immense pride and a keen sense of his own worth, this was an unbearable insult. It was a bureaucratic decision that completely disregarded his heroic service. In a characteristic act of stubborn principle, he refused the demotion and resigned his commission. For a brief period, it seemed his military career was over. He returned to his family in Kentucky, turning his attention to his modest plantation. He was a farmer once more, a life he knew and understood, but the call of the Army, the structure and purpose it provided, was too strong to ignore. When a new major's commission was offered to him the following year by his friend President James Madison, he accepted without hesitation. The interlude was over. Zachary Taylor was a soldier through and through. The next 2 decades of his life were a study in the slow, patient, and often unglamorous work of a frontier officer. This was the true making of Old Rough and Ready. It was a period spent far from the drawing rooms of Washington and the centers of power, a life lived in a succession of remote, often primitive military posts along the ever-expanding edge of the American empire. He commanded garrisons at Fort Howard in the wilds of Wisconsin, at Fort Snelling in Minnesota, and at various posts throughout Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley. This was the unglamorous but essential work of nation building, overseeing the construction of forts, mediating disputes between settlers and Native American tribes, and showing the flag in territories where American authority was still a novel concept. It was in these years that his famous persona solidified. He cared little for the pomp and ceremony of military life. He often eschewed the formal, uncomfortable uniforms of his rank in favor of the simple, practical clothing of a farmer or a frontiersman, a linen duster, a wide-brimmed straw hat, and comfortable worn-in trousers. He was a stark contrast to the spit and polish officers of the era, like his future rival Winfield Scott. Taylor's focus was not on appearances, but on results. He was known for his blunt, direct manner of speaking and his calm, unflappable demeanor in a crisis. Most importantly, he never asked his men to endure a hardship he was not willing to share himself. He lived among them, ate their simple rations, and faced the same dangers and discomforts of frontier life. This shared experience bred a fierce and enduring loyalty. His men might not have thought him a brilliant military theorist, but they knew he was tough, fair, and utterly reliable. They trusted him with their lives, and this trust was the bedrock of his leadership. This peripatetic life was an immense challenge for his wife, Peggy. While Zachary thrived in the rugged environment of the frontier, she was forced to create a home and raise a family in a series of crude, often isolated log and timber forts. She endured harsh winters, the constant threat of disease, and the profound loneliness of being one of the few women in a world of men. Yet, by all accounts, she did so with a quiet grace and unwavering devotion to her husband. She was the anchor in his restless life, the source of the domestic stability he craved but could rarely experience. Together, they raised 4 children who survived to adulthood, and their family life was marked by both deep affection and profound tragedy. One of their daughters, Sarah Knox Taylor, known affectionately as Knoxie, was a vibrant and intelligent young woman who grew up in the unique culture of the Frontier Army. It was at Fort Crawford in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, that she met a charismatic and brilliant young lieutenant serving under her father's command. The lieutenant was a recent West Point graduate, a man of striking intelligence and Southern aristocratic bearing. His name was Jefferson Davis. The two fell deeply in love, but their romance was met with fierce opposition from one man, Zachary Taylor. Taylor's objections were not personal, they were practical, born of his own hard experience. He had seen firsthand the immense toll that a military life took on families. He had watched his own beloved Peggy suffer through years of hardship and loneliness, and he was determined that his daughter would not endure the same fate. He wanted a better, more stable life for her, married to a civilian who could provide a permanent home. He forbade the relationship, but Knoxie had inherited her father's stubborn will. For 3 years, she and Davis carried on a clandestine courtship, their love deepening in the face of her father's disapproval. Finally, in 1835, Davis, seeing no other way, resigned his commission in the Army to become a planter in Mississippi. With Taylor's primary objection removed, he grudgingly gave his consent, though he pointedly refused to attend the wedding. In June of 1835, Sarah Knox Taylor and Jefferson Davis were married. For a few brief months, it seemed their story would have a happy ending. They traveled to the Davis family plantation Hurricane in a swampy, fever-ridden part of Mississippi to spend the summer. It was a fatal decision. Within weeks, both bride and groom were struck down with a virulent fever, likely malaria or yellow fever. Jefferson Davis survived, but his beloved Noxie did not. On September 15, 1835, just 3 months after her wedding day, she died in his arms. She was only 21 years old. The news was a devastating blow to Zachary Taylor. His beloved daughter was gone, and his relationship with his son-in-law was shattered, poisoned by grief and recrimination. For over a decade, the two men would not speak, a bitter estrangement that would only be healed years later, ironically, on a battlefield in Mexico, where they would fight side by side. While these family dramas unfolded, Taylor's professional life continued its steady, methodical course. In 1832, he was a key commander in a brief but brutal conflict that became known as the Black Hawk War. The war began when a faction of Sauk and Fox people, led by the aging warrior Black Hawk, crossed the Mississippi River from Iowa back into their ancestral lands in Illinois, seeking to reclaim the territory they had been forced to cede by a disputed treaty. Their return sparked panic among white settlers, and a large force of U.S. Army regulars and volunteer militia was mobilized to confront them. Taylor, now a full colonel, commanded the 1st Infantry Regiment from his headquarters at Fort Crawford. He was a voice of professionalism and restraint in a conflict often characterized by the chaotic and brutal actions of the poorly disciplined militia. He often struggled to impose regular discipline on volunteer officers during the Black Hawk War, a conflict that also saw a young Abraham Lincoln serving in the Illinois militia. His most notable act during the war was one of humane decency. After the decisive and tragic Battle of Bad Axe, where hundreds of Sauk men, women, and children were slaughtered while trying to flee across the Mississippi, Black Hawk surrendered. He was placed in Colonel Taylor's custody at Fort Crawford. When Black Hawk surrendered after the war, Taylor oversaw his custody at Fort Crawford, ensuring that the defeated leader and his follow. It was an act of profound moral courage that demonstrated a commitment to honor and the rules of war that was often absent on the violent frontier. 4 years after the Black Hawk War, Taylor was given the most challenging and arduous command of his career. He was sent to Florida to take part in the Second Seminole War. This was not a conventional conflict. It was a brutal, frustrating, and seemingly endless guerrilla war against the Seminole people who were fiercely resisting the U.S. government's policy of Indian removal. The Seminoles, under brilliant leaders like Osceola, used the vast labyrinthine swamps and hammocks of the Florida Everglades as their fortress. They refused to be rounded up and shipped west to Indian Territory. For the U.S. Army, it was a logistical and tactical nightmare. Soldiers, weighed down by heavy woolen uniforms and conventional equipment, slogged through mosquito-infested, snake-ridden swamps, hunting an enemy who knew the terrain intimately and could appear and vanish like ghosts. The war was characterized by ambushes, raids, and a relentless, debilitating toll from tropical diseases. It was in this unforgiving environment that Taylor's rough and ready leadership style was perfectly suited. He stripped his command of any unnecessary baggage, adopted the same rugged, practical dress as his men, and led from the front, enduring the same miserable conditions as the lowest private. He was determined to take the fight to the Seminoles in their own territory. On Christmas Day, 1837, he led a force of over 1,000 men deep into the Everglades, seeking a large concentration of Seminole and Miccosukee warriors who had gathered on the shores of Lake Okeechobee. The battle that followed was one of the largest and bloodiest of the entire war. The Seminole warriors had chosen their ground perfectly, concealing themselves in a dense hammock of sawgrass and cypress trees, their front protected by a half-mile of thick, sucking mud and sawgrass that was waist-deep. To attack, Taylor's men would have to advance slowly in the open, directly into a prepared and almost invisible enemy position. Taylor did not hesitate. He ordered a frontal assault. The result was a slaughter. The first waves of volunteer militia broke and fled under the withering enemy fire. The regular infantry who followed them paid a terrible price. Their officers picked off one by one as they tried to rally their men in the thick mud. The fighting was at close quarters, desperate and savage. But Taylor's persistence and the sheer numerical superiority of his force eventually paid off. After 3 hours of brutal fighting, the regulars finally managed to turn the Seminoles' flank, and the warriors, having inflicted heavy casualties, staged a disciplined retreat, disappearing back into the swamps. By the brutal calculus of war, the Battle of Lake Okeechobee was an American victory. Taylor's army held the field, but it was a victory purchased at a staggering cost. 26 American soldiers were killed and 112 were wounded, a casualty rate of over 10%, making it one of the costliest battles in the history of American conflicts with Native Americans. Taylor himself was praised for his courage. His horse was shot out from under him during the battle, but he was also criticized by some for his costly and perhaps reckless reliance on a frontal assault. Nonetheless, in a war that had seen few clear-cut American successes, the battle was hailed as a major triumph. It earned Taylor a promotion to brigadier general and overall command of all U.S. forces in Florida. It also cemented his nickname in the national press. He was now, and forever, Old Rough and Ready. He would spend another 2 years in the swamps, prosecuting a grim and thankless war of attrition, before finally requesting a transfer, exhausted and weary of the brutal conflict. Throughout these long years of military service, Taylor was simultaneously and diligently building his own personal fortune. He was not just a soldier, he was an astute businessman and a committed planter. Using his army pay and his wife's inheritance, he began to acquire land. In 1841, he purchased a large, undeveloped tract of land in Jefferson County, Mississippi, which he named Cypress Grove Plantation. He poured his resources into developing this property, purchasing more and more enslaved people to clear the land and cultivate cotton. By the mid-1840s, he owned over 100 human beings. This was the central uncomfortable duality of his life. He was a dedicated public servant, a man who repeatedly risked his life for his country, and he was an active and unapologetic participant in the brutal institution of slavery. He was a man of the Union, but his personal wealth and way of life were inextricably tied to the peculiar institution of the South. This deep internal contradiction, which he seemed to see with little conflict, was a mirror of the larger unresolved contradiction that was beginning to tear the nation itself apart. In 1841, he was given command of the 2nd Military Department, with his headquarters at Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was a vast and important command, responsible for the entire southwestern frontier. For several years, he lived a relatively quiet life, overseeing his command, managing his growing agricultural interests, and enjoying a rare period of relative stability with his family. But the calm was not to last. Great forces were at work, driven by a national ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the continent. To the south, the young Republic of Texas, having broken away from Mexico, was clamoring for annexation. This single issue, the annexation of Texas, would soon ignite a new and momentous conflict. A war that would pluck Zachary Taylor from the relative obscurity of the frontier and transform him into the most famous man in America, setting him on an improbable and unforeseen path to the White House itself. The quiet years were over. The drums of war were beginning to beat once more. The America of the 1840s was a nation drunk on a potent and intoxicating idea, manifest destiny. It was more than just a policy. It was a quasi-religious conviction, a belief whispered in taverns, preached from pulpits, and thundered in the halls of Congress that the United States was divinely ordained to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This powerful expansionist fever gripped the nation, and it found its ultimate political champion in a stern, unyielding Tennessean named James K. Polk. Elected to the presidency in 1844 on a platform of territorial acquisition, Polk was a man of singular, almost obsessive focus. He had promised the American people Oregon and Texas, and he was determined to deliver, by diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary. In 1845, Polk made good on his first promise. The United States formally annexed the Republic of Texas, an act that was celebrated with patriotic fervor in Washington, but viewed in Mexico City as an intolerable act of aggression. The Mexican government had never recognized the independence of its breakaway province, and from its perspective, the United States had just stolen a massive piece of its sovereign territory. Diplomatic relations were severed, and the two nations stood on a knife's edge, teetering on the brink of war. The flashpoint, the single patch of ground that would ignite the continent, was a desolate, sparsely populated stretch of land between two rivers. Mexico had always maintained that the southern border of Texas was the Nueces River. The United States, siding with the Texans, now insisted that the border was the Rio Grande, over 100 miles to the south. This disputed territory, a land of arid plains and thorny chaparral, became the tinderbox for a conflict that would forever redraw the map of North America. It was into this volatile situation that Brigadier General Zachary Taylor was thrust. In the summer of 1845, President Polk, in a calculated move of military chess, ordered Taylor to move his small army of observation from its post in Louisiana to a strategic position at Corpus Christi, on the banks of the Nueces River. On the surface, it was a defensive maneuver, a move to protect the newly annexed state. But in reality, it was a deliberate provocation, a placement of American troops at the very edge of the disputed zone. For months, Taylor's army of some 4,000 men languished at Corpus Christi. It was a miserable, unhealthy camp, a place of mind-numbing boredom, endless drills, and rampant disease. But it was also a crucible, a place where a small force of U.S. Army regulars and newly raised volunteer regiments were forged into a disciplined, cohesive fighting force under Taylor's watchful eye. While his army drilled under the hot Texas sun, Polk's diplomatic efforts to purchase California and New Mexico from Mexico and to settle the border dispute failed spectacularly. The Mexican government, in a state of political turmoil, refused to even receive his envoy. Polk, a man who did not suffer rejection well, now believed that only a show of force would achieve his aims. In January of 1846, the fateful order was sent from Washington to Corpus Christi. Taylor was to advance his army from the Nueces to the northern bank of the Rio Grande. This was no longer a defensive posture. It was an explicit and aggressive move into territory that Mexico considered its own. It was the final, deliberate shove that would push the two nations into open war. In March of 1846, Taylor's army began the arduous 150-mile march south. They moved through a hostile landscape Their supply lines stretched thin, their every move watched by Mexican scouts. Finally, they arrived on the banks of the Rio Grande, directly opposite the fortified Mexican city of Matamoros. There, under the noses of the Mexican army, the Americans began to construct an earthen star-shaped fort, which they provocatively named Fort Texas. Their cannons were aimed directly at the heart of the Mexican city. For the Mexican commander, General Mariano Arista, this was an invasion, an act of war in all but name. He moved his own troops across the river, and for several tense, anxious weeks, the two armies faced each other in a nervous, high-stakes standoff, the silence broken only by the exchange of military music and shouted insults across the muddy water. The first shot was almost inevitable. On April 25, 1846, a Mexican cavalry force of 1,600 men crossed the Rio Grande upstream from the American position and ambushed a patrol of 63 U.S. dragoons led by Captain Seth Thornton. The skirmish was brief and one-sided. 16 Americans were killed or wounded, and the rest were captured. When the news of the Thornton affair reached President Polk in Washington 2 weeks later, he had the casus belli he had been seeking. He went before Congress and, in a masterful piece of political rhetoric, declared that Mexico had invaded our territory and shed American blood upon the American soil. The message electrified a nation already primed for war. On May 13, 1846, Congress voted overwhelmingly to declare war on Mexico. The conflict that Zachary Taylor had been preparing for was now a reality. He did not have to wait long for his first major test. General Arista, emboldened by his initial success, crossed the bulk of his army over the Rio Grande, determined to crush the small American force and relieve the siege of Fort Texas. Taylor, learning of the Mexican advance, marched his own army out to meet them. The two forces collided on May 8, 1846, on a wide, flat prairie covered in tall, sharp-edged grass, a place called Palo Alto. The Battle of Palo Alto was not a battle of infantry charges and cavalry dashes. It was an artilleryman's duel, and it showcased a decisive American technological and tactical advantage. The Mexican army was larger, but its cannons were mostly older, bronze pieces that fired solid iron shot. The American artillery, in contrast, was a highly mobile professional force, equipped with modern, lightweight brass cannons. These flying artillery units, developed by Major Samuel Ringgold, could be rapidly unlimbered, fired, and then limbered up again, pulled by teams of horses to new positions on the battlefield with astonishing speed. As the two armies faced each other, the American cannons opened fire, tearing horrific gaps in the dense Mexican infantry formations. The Mexican artillery answered, but their solid shot was largely ineffective, often burying itself harmlessly in the soft prairie soil. For hours, the American guns dominated the battlefield, their relentless fire inflicting terrible casualties and shaking the morale of the Mexican soldiers, who could do little but stand and endure the punishment. At the end of the day, Arista was forced to pull his battered army back. The first major battle of the war was a clear American victory, though it came at a cost. Major Ringgold, the brilliant architect of the flying artillery, was mortally wounded. The next day, May 9th, Arista took up a new, stronger defensive position a few miles away at a place called Resaca de la Palma. It was a stark contrast to the open prairie of Palo Alto. The terrain was a dense, almost impenetrable thicket of thorny chaparral and mesquite, cut through by a series of dry ravines, or resacas. Here, the American artillery advantage would be nullified. This would be a close, brutal infantryman's fight. Arista placed his best troops and his remaining cannons to cover the single road that passed through the thicket. Taylor, arriving on the scene, did not hesitate. He ordered a direct assault. The fighting that followed was a chaotic, confused, and savage affair. American units became separated in the dense brush, and the battle broke down into a series of small, desperate, hand-to-hand struggles. Men fought with bayonets, clubbed muskets, and knives amidst the thorns and ravines. The decisive moment came when Taylor ordered Captain Charles May's squadron of dragoons to charge the Mexican artillery position. In a wild, reckless gallop down the narrow road, May and his men stormed the Mexican guns, capturing the battery and its commander. The loss of their cannons broke the back of the Mexican defense. The Mexican lines wavered, then broke completely, the soldiers fleeing in a panicked rout back toward the Rio Grande. Many drowned trying to swim the river to safety. The Battle of Resaca de la Palma was a total and devastating victory for Taylor. In 2 days of fighting, he had completely shattered the main Mexican army in the north, driven it from Texas, and secured the border. The news of the victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma electrified the United States. In a matter of days, Zachary Taylor was transformed from a little-known frontier general into the nation's greatest military hero. He was old, rough, and ready, the man who knew how to win. After his stunning initial victories, Taylor paused to regroup and await reinforcements. He then crossed the Rio Grande, occupying the city of Matamoros. His next objective was the major strategic hub of northern Mexico, the heavily fortified city of Monterrey. In late August, he began the long, grueling march south with an army of some 6,000 men. The march through the parched, mountainous landscape was an ordeal, but in mid-September, his army arrived before the city. Monterrey was a formidable challenge. It was a stone city, defended by a series of massive, well-placed forts, its streets barricaded, its thick-walled houses turned into miniature fortresses. The battle for the city, which began on September 21st, was a brutal, bloody, and desperate affair. For 3 days, American soldiers engaged in vicious urban warfare, a type of fighting for which they were ill-prepared. They fought their way from house to house, using ladders to scale rooftops and picks and crowbars to smash their way through the walls of adjoining buildings. The fighting was savage, with heavy casualties on both sides, as they battled through the fortified streets towards the city's central plaza. By the 3rd day, the Mexican commander, his position untenable, offered to surrender. It was here that Taylor made a decision that would enrage President Polk and change the course of his own destiny. Instead of demanding an unconditional surrender, which would have meant taking the entire Mexican army prisoner, Taylor, citing his own heavy losses and a critical lack of supplies, granted the Mexican army a generous 8-week armistice. He allowed the defeated soldiers to march out of the city with their honor intact, taking their personal weapons and a single battery of artillery with them in exchange for the immediate surrender of the city. To Taylor, it was a practical, soldierly decision, a way to secure his objective without further needless bloodshed. When news of the armistice reached Washington weeks later, President Polk erupted in a volcanic fury. He saw it not as a pragmatic military decision, but as a politically motivated act of defiance by a Whig general who was now becoming a potential political rival. He was convinced that Taylor had deliberately let the enemy army escape to fight another day, thereby prolonging the war and undermining the administration. Polk fumed in his diary. General Taylor has acted in violation of his express orders. It is a source of deep mortification and regret. He immediately ordered the armistice to be terminated and resolved to sideline his newfound political rival. In a move that was both punitive and strategically risky, Polk decided to strip Taylor's army of the majority of its veteran troops, reassigning them to a new invasion force being assembled under General Winfield Scott for a direct assault on Mexico City. He would leave Old Rough and Ready with a small skeletal force of mostly untested volunteers, hoping to starve him of any further opportunity for glory. It was one of the greatest miscalculations of Polk's presidency, and it would nearly lead to a military catastrophe. At that very moment, the mercurial and opportunistic Mexican general Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was assembling a massive new army. Santa Anna, who had been living in exile in Cuba, had cleverly duped Polk into granting him safe passage back to Mexico, promising he would negotiate a peace treaty. Once back in his homeland, he promptly seized power and raised a fresh army of over 20,000 men. When his spies informed him that Taylor's force had been gutted, he saw a golden opportunity. He force-marched his huge army north across hundreds of miles of brutal desert, determined to surprise and annihilate the weakened American force and reclaim northern Mexico. In February of 1847, near a mountain pass called Buena Vista, south of the city of Saltillo, Santa Anna's massive army fell upon Taylor's small, beleaguered force of less than 5,000 men, the vast majority of whom were raw volunteers who had never seen combat. The battle that followed was one of the most desperate, dramatic, and iconic in American military history. For 2 long, bloody days, the vastly outnumbered American army was pushed to the very brink of destruction. On the morning of February 22nd, Santa Anna sent a messenger with a demand for unconditional surrender, noting that Taylor was surrounded by 20,000 men and could not possibly avoid being cut to pieces. Taylor's alleged reply, delivered by a junior officer, became the stuff of legend. "I beg leave to say that I decline acceding to your request." The battle began in earnest. The Mexican attacks were relentless. Wave after wave of colorfully uniformed infantry and lancers crashing against the small American line, which was stretched thin across the narrow pass. At several points, the American lines, particularly on the left flank, composed of a volunteer regiment from Indiana, buckled and nearly broke, sending panicked soldiers fleeing to the rear. The battle hung in the balance, a chaotic swirl of smoke, dust, and close-quarters combat. But the American soldiers, particularly the highly effective light artillery and a disciplined regiment of volunteers from Mississippi, fought with incredible tenacity. The Mississippi Rifles were commanded by a man who had not spoken to Zachary Taylor in over a decade, his estranged son-in-law, Colonel Jefferson Davis. In a moment of tactical brilliance, Davis formed his men into a V-shaped formation that shattered a charge by Mexican lancers, a maneuver that helped to save the crumbling American flank. Throughout the chaos, Zachary Taylor himself was the picture of calm courage. Utterly fearless, he sat calmly on his horse, Old Whitey, amidst a hail of bullets and cannonballs, a conspicuous and inspiring target directing the defense. In another legendary moment, when one of his artillery captains, Braxton Bragg, was being overrun, a subordinate desperately informed Taylor that a single shot from Bragg's cannon would not be enough to stop the Mexican advance. Taylor's supposed reply, "Double shot your guns and give them hell, Bragg," was later cleaned up for the more genteel public as "a little more grape, Captain Bragg." In the end, the American lines held. Santa Anna, his army battered, exhausted, and demoralized by the stubborn American resistance, was forced to retreat under the cover of darkness. Taylor had won a stunning, almost miraculous victory against overwhelming odds. The news of Buena Vista set off a wave of national celebration. The president, in his attempt to sideline his rival, had inadvertently created a political colossus. Zachary Taylor, the hero of Buena Vista, the plain-spoken general who had defeated the great Santa Anna against all odds, was now the most famous and beloved man in America. His path to the White House, a destination he had never sought, was now wide open. The victory at Buena Vista was more than just a military triumph. It was a political earthquake. In the halls of the White House, President James K. Polk, who had deliberately tried to orchestrate Zachary Taylor's failure, could only watch in stunned disbelief as his plan backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. He'd meant to sideline a politically inconvenient general. Instead, he had created a national icon, a living legend whose popularity now eclipsed his own. The name Old Rough and Ready was on every American's lips. His image was everywhere, on cheap prints sold in city squares, on household crockery, and on the covers of popular songs celebrating his miraculous victory. He was the American Cincinnatus, the humble farmer soldier who had answered his country's call and defeated a tyrant against impossible odds. He was, in short, everything the American public craved in a hero, and everything the professional politicians in Washington had come to fear. Taylor himself seemed largely bewildered by the sudden adulation. He was a soldier, a man who understood the clear-cut realities of the battlefield, not the murky, shifting allegiances of politics. From his dusty camp in northern Mexico, he read the newspapers from home with a mixture of amusement and alarm, as his name was increasingly floated as a candidate for the presidency in the upcoming 1848 election. He had never voted in his life, had no affiliation with any political party, and possessed a soldier's deep-seated contempt for what he saw as the self-serving, dishonest world of politicians. His initial reaction was to dismiss the idea out of hand. "Such an idea never entered my head," he wrote to his son-in-law, "nor is it likely to enter the head of any sane person." But the idea was not going away. The United States in 1848 was a nation cracking under the immense strain of its own success. The very territories that Taylor and his army had won from Mexico had become a poison pill, a source of profound and bitter sectional division. The central explosive question was whether slavery would be allowed to expand into these new lands. In 1846, a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot had attached a proviso to a war funding bill, stipulating that slavery should be forever banned from any territory acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot proviso, though it never became law, ignited a political firestorm. It shattered the old party lines, realigning American politics not around economic issues, but along a stark geographic north-south divide. For the South, the proviso was an outrageous assault on their property rights and their honor. For the increasingly anti-slavery North, it was a moral line in the sand. Congress was paralyzed, and the nation was drifting toward disunion. In this climate of crisis, the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, were themselves fracturing. The Democrats, under President Polk, were seen as the party of aggressive expansion and pro-Southern interests. The Whigs were a fragile, often contradictory coalition of Northern industrialists, Southern planters, and Western farmers bound together more by their opposition to the Democrats than by a coherent ideology. Their great leaders, men like the brilliant orator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and the master compromiser Henry Clay of Kentucky, were seen by many as tired figures from a bygone era. The Whigs were desperate for a winner, a candidate who could transcend the toxic slavery debate and unite the country. And in the hero of Buena Vista, they saw their salvation. Taylor's appeal was his ambiguity. He was a Southerner and a large slave owner, which the Whigs hoped would reassure the South and prevent them from bolting the party. But he was also seen as a staunch nationalist, a soldier whose first loyalty was to the flag and the Union, not to any particular section. His political views were a complete mystery, which allowed people from all sides to project their own hopes onto him. Northern abolitionists hoped his nationalism would lead him to oppose slavery's expansion, while Southern slaveholders assumed his personal background would make him a reliable defender of their interests. He was a blank slate, and in a country weary of professional politicians, that was his greatest strength. Throughout 1847, a Taylor for President movement, fueled by a strange coalition of political operatives, newspaper editors, and ordinary citizens, began to gather momentum, largely without Taylor's active participation. He continued to command his army in Mexico, responding to the political overtures with a series of famously clumsy and non-committal letters. He insisted he was not a candidate and would only serve if drafted by the spontaneous will of the people. In his first Allison letter, a key public statement, he admitted that he was a Whig, but not an ultra-Whig, and declared that if elected he would be a president for all the people, not a tool of any party. This above-the-fray posture, while infuriating to party insiders who demanded loyalty, was pure political gold with the public. It reinforced his image as an honest, independent leader, a man untainted by the corrupt bargains of Washington. In June of 1848, the Whig Party gathered in Philadelphia for its national convention. The atmosphere was tense and uncertain. The party was deeply divided. The anti-slavery conscience Whigs of the North were horrified by the prospect of nominating a slave owner. The party's old guard still clung to the hope that one of their own, like Clay or Webster, would be chosen. But the tide of public opinion was undeniable. The delegates, driven by the pragmatic desire to win, understood that only Taylor had the broad popular appeal to carry the election. After 4 contentious ballots, the professional politicians were swept aside, and the amateur soldier, Zachary Taylor, was declared the Whig nominee for President of the United States. To balance the ticket and appease the northern wing of the party, they nominated Millard Fillmore, a respected but unremarkable politician from New York, as his running mate. The nomination of a slave-owning general with no political experience was too much for many conscience Whigs. They stormed out of the convention, vowing to form a new party dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery. The presidential campaign of 1848 was one of the strangest in American history. Taylor, in a brilliant strategic move, largely remained at his home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, saying almost nothing. He ran a no-platform campaign, allowing his heroic reputation to do the work for him. One of the most famous incidents of the campaign perfectly encapsulated his appeal. When the Whig Party sent him the official letter notifying him of his nomination, it was sent with postage due. Taylor, a frugal man who was inundated with unsolicited mail, had a standing policy of refusing to pay the postage on any letters from people he didn't know. The official notification sat in the dead letter office for weeks until a frantic party official finally realized what had happened. The story, when it got out, was a public relations triumph. It perfectly reinforced his image as old, rough, and ready, a simple, honest man, completely unconcerned with the self-important rituals of politics. His opponents struggled to land a blow. The Democratic nominee, Lewis Cass of Michigan, was a bland and uninspiring party regular who tried to straddle the slavery issue by championing a vague doctrine called popular sovereignty, which proposed letting the settlers in each territory decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This position satisfied no one. The real wild card was the third party that had emerged from the ashes of the Whig Convention, the Free Soil Party, a coalition of anti-slavery Democrats, disgruntled conscience Whigs, and abolitionists. They nominated a former president, Martin Van Buren, as their candidate. Their platform was simple and clear: free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. They had no chance of winning the presidency, but they were destined to be the ultimate spoiler. When the votes were counted in November, the result was a testament to the nation's fractured state. Taylor won with a plurality of the popular vote, but a comfortable majority in the Electoral College. The election was decided in the crucial state of New York. There, the free soil ticket, led by the New Yorker Martin Van Buren, siphoned just enough votes away from the Democrat Lewis Cass to throw the state, and thus the presidency, to Zachary Taylor. In one of history's great ironies, the anti-slavery party had inadvertently secured the election of a Southern slave owner. The president-elect embarked on a long, triumphant journey from Louisiana to Washington, greeted at every stop by adoring crowds. But as he traveled, the immense weight of the task before him began to settle in. He was a man utterly unprepared for the presidency. He knew little of economics, of foreign policy, or of the intricate dance of legislation. He had to assemble a cabinet from scratch, relying on the advice of politicians he barely knew and did not fully trust. On March 5, 1849, the inauguration was delayed a day because March 4th fell on a Sunday. The 64-year-old Taylor, looking weathered and slightly uncomfortable in his formal civilian clothes, stood on the east portico of the Capitol and took the oath of office. The old soldier had entered his final and most difficult field of battle. Any hope that Taylor's presidency might be a quiet one was shattered almost immediately by news from the far side of the continent. In January of 1848, just before the treaty ending the Mexican-American War was signed, a carpenter named James Marshall had discovered gold at a sawmill in a remote California valley. The news, at first a trickle, had become a flood by the time Taylor took office. The California gold rush was on. A massive, chaotic, and unprecedented wave of humanity, hundreds of thousands of 49ers, poured into the new American territory from all over the world, transforming a sleepy pastoral backwater into a lawless, booming frontier overnight. This population explosion created an immediate and desperate crisis. California needed a government. It needed laws, courts, and a system of order to tame the wild energy of the gold fields. The crisis forced the slavery issue to a head far sooner than anyone in Washington had anticipated. Under the old Missouri Compromise of 1820, slavery had been banned in the Louisiana Purchase Territory north of the 36 degrees, 30 minutes parallel. But that line did not extend to the Pacific, and no one could agree on how to organize the new territories of California and New Mexico. The southern states were determined that their citizens should be able to take their enslaved property into these new lands. The northern states were just as determined that they should remain free. Congress was deadlocked, engaged in a bitter and fruitless debate that was pushing the nation ever closer to the brink of secession. It was into this political firestorm that President Taylor, the supposed political amateur, stepped with a plan of breathtaking simplicity and boldness. He decided to cut through the Gordian knot of congressional debate altogether. His solution was to bypass the territorial stage entirely. He sent secret agents to California and New Mexico, encouraging the settlers there to draft state constitutions and apply directly to Congress for admission to the Union. It was a shrewd and audacious move. Taylor knew that the settlers in these regions, largely non-Southerners, would almost certainly draft constitutions that banned slavery. His plan would bring two new free states into the Union, decisively tipping the balance of power against the South in the Senate, and it would do so by appealing to the democratic principle of self-government, making it difficult for his opponents to argue against. When news of Taylor's plan leaked out, the South erupted in a fury. To them, it was a profound betrayal. A Southern slave-owning president was actively working to block the expansion of slavery and permanently reduce the political power of their section. The fire eaters, the radical pro-slavery extremists, were enraged. They accused Taylor of being a traitor to his class and his region. Threats of secession, which had long been a feature of Southern rhetoric, now became deadly serious. A convention of Southern states was called for Nashville, Tennessee, to discuss the possibility of disunion. The giants of the Senate, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and the grim, dying ideologue of the South, John C. Calhoun, were equally appalled, though for different reasons. They saw Taylor's plan as a dangerously simplistic and confrontational approach to a problem that required delicate, nuanced compromise. They believed the president, in his military bluntness, was acting like a general issuing orders, ignoring the prerogatives of Congress, and inflaming sectional passions to the point of no return. In response to the crisis, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, returned to the Senate floor to propose a grand comprehensive solution, a single omnibus bill that would become known as the Compromise of 1850. But President Taylor would have none of it. He was a man of simple, unshakable convictions. He believed his plan was the most direct and honest way to solve the crisis. He viewed Clay's complex package of compromises as a morally dubious bargain, an appeasement of the secessionists he had come to despise. A deep and bitter rift opened between the Whig president and the Whig leadership in Congress. Taylor dug in his heels, using all the power of his office to block the compromise. The political situation in Washington devolved into a tense, high-stakes standoff. The Union, it seemed, was on the verge of collapsing, held together only by the stubborn, unyielding will of its rough-and-ready president. When a delegation of Southern leaders came to the White House to threaten secession to his face, Taylor, the old soldier, did not flinch. He told them in no uncertain terms that if they attempted to leave the Union, he would personally lead the army to crush their rebellion and hang them as traitors. The amateur politician, it turned out, had a core of iron. As the hot, humid summer of 1850 descended on Washington, the nation held its breath. The fate of the republic seemed to rest on a collision course between a determined president and a defiant Congress. The sweltering summer of 1850 found Washington, D.C., not just in the grip of an oppressive heat wave, but in the throes of a political fever that threatened to consume the republic. The Capitol building was a cauldron of rage and recrimination. Day after day, the great titans of the Senate, Henry Clay, his body frail but his voice still commanding, a dying spectral John C. Calhoun, his final warnings read by a colleague, and the formidable Daniel Webster, his words echoing with the weight of the Union, debated the future of the nation. Clay's great compromise, a complex and sprawling omnibus bill, was the only thing on the table, a last desperate attempt to stitch the fracturing country back together. It proposed admitting California as a free state, organizing the rest of the Mexican cession into territories with no federal restrictions on slavery, settling a Texas border dispute, and enacting a draconian new fugitive slave law. It was a package designed to give something to everyone, and therefore it fully satisfied no one. And standing in the way of it all, a granite-like obstacle of sheer unyielding will, was the President of the United States. Zachary Taylor despised the compromise. He saw it as a capitulation to the threats of Southern extremists, a messy, immoral bargain that sacrificed principle for political expediency. His own plan remained his North Star: admit California and New Mexico as free states immediately, and deal with any other issues later. He made his position brutally clear to any who would listen. He opposed Clay's compromise and made clear he was prepared to veto it, favoring instead the swift admission of California and New Mexico as free states. The standoff was absolute. The president and the congressional leadership of his own party were at war, and the Union was the battlefield. This was the tense, explosive atmosphere on the 4th of July, 1850. The nation's 74th birthday dawned hot and humid, a typical Washington summer day. President Taylor, ever the patriot, was scheduled to attend a long outdoor ceremony at the construction site of a new, towering monument dedicated to the nation's first president, George Washington. For hours, Taylor sat under the merciless sun, listening to a series of long-winded speeches. He was a man accustomed to the hardships of the field, but he was also 65 years old, and the heat was draining. To quench his thirst and find some relief, he reportedly consumed a large quantity of cherries and iced milk on a sweltering day, an indulgence that many later suspected had triggered the fatal gastrointestinal illness. That evening, the first cramps began. They were sharp and severe, quickly followed by violent waves of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. The president was gravely ill. His physicians were summoned, and after a brief examination, they rendered their diagnosis: cholera morbus. It was a vague catch-all term of the era for any acute gastrointestinal illness, but it conveyed the severity of the situation. Their treatment was a grim reflection of the medical knowledge of the time. They administered large doses of ipecac and calomel, a toxic mercury compound, to induce further vomiting and purging, believing this would expel the poisons from his system. They gave him quinine and opium to control the symptoms, and, almost certainly, they resorted to bloodletting, weakening the president even further. For 5 agonizing days, a terrible battle raged within the presidential mansion. Taylor's robust constitution, hardened by decades on the frontier, fought against the invisible enemy ravaging his body. But the illness, combined with the debilitating treatments, was too much. He grew progressively weaker, severely dehydrated, and delirious. The nation waited. News from the White House passed in hushed, anxious whispers. By July 9th, it was clear the end was near. In a moment of lucidity, he gathered his family and spoke his final poignant words. "I have tried to discharge my duties faithfully," he whispered. "I regret nothing, but I am sorry that I am about to leave my friends." A few hours later, on the evening of July 9th, 1850, Zachary Taylor, the 12th President of the United States, was dead. He had been in office for just 16 months. The nation was plunged into a state of shock and mourning. A grand, somber funeral procession snaked through the streets of Washington. But beneath the public grief, a seismic political shift was already underway. The moment Taylor drew his last breath, the presidency passed to his vice president, Millard Fillmore. And Fillmore was a very different man. Where Taylor was a stubborn, unyielding outsider, Fillmore was a pragmatic, conventional politician, a man far more inclined to compromise. He immediately signaled his support for Henry Clay's bill. With the presidential veto no longer a threat, the path was clear. The Great Compromise of 1850, which Taylor had fought so bitterly to defeat, was broken into smaller bills and passed by Congress in the months that followed. For a brief, fleeting decade, the specter of civil war was averted. The Union was saved, but only by the sudden and convenient death of its president. It was this very convenience that gave birth to the whispers. The timing was just too perfect. The one man standing in the way of a political solution that so many powerful figures desperately wanted was suddenly, inexplicably gone. The theory of assassination by poison began to spread almost immediately. The motive was clear: to remove the intransigent president and allow the compromise to pass. saving the Union and protecting the interests of both Southern slaveholders and Northern financiers, who dreaded the economic chaos of disunion. The suspects were the radical Southern fire eaters, the very men Taylor had threatened to hang. The means, it was widely believed, was arsenic. Arsenic was the perfect 19th century murder weapon. It was tasteless, odorless, and readily available. Crucially, the symptoms of acute arsenic poisoning, violent cramping, vomiting, and diarrhea, were almost identical to the symptoms of cholera and other gastrointestinal diseases. A murder could be easily disguised as a natural death. For nearly a century and a half, the poisoning theory remained one of American history's most persistent and tantalizing conspiracy theories, a dark counter-narrative to the official story, a theory impossible to either prove or disprove. That all changed in the late 1980s, thanks to the dogged efforts of a historical novelist and former University of Florida humanities professor named Clara Rising. While researching a book on Taylor, she became convinced that the poisoning theory was credible and that only modern science could provide a definitive answer. She began a long and difficult campaign to have the president's remains exhumed for forensic analysis. After years of navigating a maze of bureaucracy and persuading Taylor's living descendants, she finally succeeded. On June 17, 1991, in a scene that seemed to blur the lines between history, science, and a television drama, a team of forensic anthropologists, medical examiners, and scientists gathered at the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. The massive granite mausoleum was open, and the president's crumbling 141-year-old metallic coffin was carefully removed. In a nearby medical tent, the team painstakingly collected small samples of what remained: hair, fingernails, and bone fragments. These samples were then flown to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, one of the world's most advanced nuclear research facilities. There, scientists would use a technique called neutron activation analysis. By bombarding the samples with neutrons in a nuclear reactor, they could detect the presence of trace elements like arsenic with a sensitivity and precision unimaginable in 1850. The world's press waited with bated breath. The results came back a few days later. The scientists had indeed found arsenic in the samples, but the quantities were minuscule, hundreds, even thousands, of times lower than what would be expected in a case of acute arsenic poisoning. The levels were, in fact, entirely consistent with the normal amounts of arsenic that people in the 19th century absorbed from their environment. The verdict was clear, unequivocal, and definitive. President Zachary Taylor had not been poisoned with arsenic. The great conspiracy theory, which had endured for 141 years, was finally and conclusively debunked by science. The official story, it turned out, was the true story. Old Rough and Ready had not been felled by an assassin's plot, but by a microscopic enemy, a bacterial infection that had overwhelmed his body, a simple, tragic, and all too common fate in the 19th century. In the end, Zachary Taylor's presidency is little more than a historical footnote lasting just 16 months. But the man himself is a story of profound American contradiction. He was a lifelong slave owner who, once in the White House, became the iron-willed enemy of slavery's expansion. When Southern leaders, his own people, threatened disunion, he promised them not negotiation but the gallows. His sudden death remains one of the great turning points in American history. It raises the haunting question: if he had lived, would his unyielding stance have provoked an earlier civil war? Or did his death save the Union by allowing the fragile compromise of 1850 to pass, merely delaying the inevitable conflict? we will never know the answer. We are left only with the image of the reluctant president, a quiet, practical man more at home in a military tent than the White House. He was the soldier who answered the call, one last time, to defend the Union against his own people from within the very heart of the government.